Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, you can call our weather info line 1-885-937-4977. That is the newer number, has replaced the one that we used to use. Again, that is 1-885-937-4977. And you can visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, get updates to the forecast, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. For our warnings that we have out, these are all red flag warnings in the central and eastern interior out until midnight on Monday night for warm, dry, windy conditions as well as thunderstorm activity in those areas. And then in the central interior, we also have a dense smoke advisory out until midnight Sunday night. Taking a little deeper dive into the fire danger we have on today, likely at the peak of our season. Ignitions are occurring easily, which means that a lot of the initial efforts to mitigate fires are no longer fully effective. With the hot and dry conditions combined with the thunderstorms for today and on Sunday, there is the chance for more ignitions and rapid fire spread, so be careful out there. It is quite a bit of fire danger still remaining, quite a bit of smoke out there as well. For some of the more southern locations like the Panhandle into the Copper River Basin area, we are seeing some more moderate conditions. And as we look forward in time, we do expect a pattern change as we get closer towards Tuesday of this coming week, where we'll see some cooler and damper weather. However, before it alleviates too many of our fire concerns, we do need to get at least of an inch of rain over several days to have any kind of long-term impacts to our fire behavior. So even though we are expecting that change, it is still going to have some higher fire danger for a while. As far as our map here, we can see that in the central and western portions of the interior, we're getting up to very high to extreme fire danger conditions. That's going to extend up into the Yukon Flats area as well. Then we have some areas of high danger up along the North Slope and then down in south central Alaska and the Copper River Basin. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we'll start off near Kodiak Island, where we have a low pressure system bringing some rain to much of the Gulf of Alaska areas. And as we look out further to the east with that, we can see some of the cloud cover moving in towards the Panhandle area, spreading more rain to the Panhandle finally. And then up in the interior portion of the state, we can see our cloud cover with some of our showers out by the Alaska Range as well as much of the central and eastern interior. And then finally we'll look out west as we have a low approaching the northern portion of the Bering Sea, bringing some rain to some of those northern locations as well. As we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we're going to focus on mainland Alaska, where a lot of our more concerning activity is. We have thunderstorms extending around much of the central portion of the state, including the Brooks Range, down through the Alaska Range, and into southwest Alaska as well. Areas of smoke throughout much of the mainland with some of the higher concentrations in the interior, and then some areas of fog up along the Arctic coastline underneath some high pressure up there. As we look down south, we're going to see some showers throughout much of south central area, and then some rain extending from Kodiak Island through all of the Gulf and North Gulf Coast, including Prince William Sound, down into the Panhandle. System approaching from the south is going to help to reinforce that rain, but for now that stays south of Kodiak Island, and then some rain for the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians. As we step into tonight, we're going to have a low pressure system moving into the northwestern portions of the Bering Sea, bringing some rain closer to St. Matthew and St. Lawrence Islands. But out over mainland Alaska, where a lot of our activity is, will diminish some of the thunderstorm threat overnight, but we are going to keep smoke throughout much of the central and northern portions of the mainland. Again, some of the highest concentrations of that dense smoke out over the central interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, going to see more fog develop overnight. And then down in south central Alaska, with our low out over the Gulf of Alaska waters, we are going to see rain extending from Kodiak Island, once again through the North Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle. As we move into Sunday, that low will push further into the eastern portions of the Gulf, bringing some heavier rainfall to the Panhandle area on Sunday. As we look along the North Gulf Coast, some lighter areas around South Central with some areas of rain by Kodiak Island as well. And then we're going to see more showers as we get closer towards the Alaska Range with the potential for afternoon and evening thunderstorms throughout much of the interior, Brooks Range, and Alaska Range. And then areas of smoke again through much of the central and northern portions of mainland Alaska. As we look out over the Bering Sea, our low pressure is approaching St. Matthew Island, starting to bring rain out towards the Pribilof Islands and down into the central Aleutians. Looking out on Monday, that low will push over the Pribilof Islands area, bringing rain to those islands as well as down by the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, and starting to push rain closer towards the west coast. Out over mainland Alaska, still seeing the threat of afternoon and evening thunderstorms on Monday for much of the central and eastern interior, down to the Alaska Range and up through the Brooks Range. Up along the far northwestern portions of the state, we're going to see cold enough temperatures to see a mix of rain and snow by AKwx. And then dropping all the way down south by south central Alaska, we are going to see rain throughout much of south central from that low that's sitting out over the eastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, and then some rain out through much of the Panhandle as well. Looking at some of our temperatures, we'll start with low temps on Sunday morning for the Panhandle area, dropping down to the mid to lower 50s. That's going to be true for much of south central as well, with some areas in the Copper River Basin down by Valdez getting into the upper 40s. So you look at our afternoon highs on Sunday afternoon down in the Panhandle, getting up to around 60 degrees, with Juneau and Haines both getting up to 62 degrees. For south central Alaska, getting into the 60s for most locations, however a little bit warmer in some of the more interior places, Talkeetna getting up to 70, and Glen Allen getting up to 73. Dropping down on Monday morning in the Panhandle down into the lower 50s, with Yakutat dropping down to 49 degrees, and then lower to mid 50s for much of south central as well. Valdez getting a little bit colder there, getting down to 49. So look at the afternoon highs on Monday afternoon, getting back up to around 60 degrees for most locations in the Panhandle, and getting up into the 60s for many places around south central Alaska, and up into the 70s for those more interior locations. For Sunday morning, low temperatures for the northern portions of the state, dropping down into the upper 50s for much of the interior, and then into the 40s for much of the North Slope areas, and into the mid to upper 40s for much of the west coast as well. Sunday afternoon highs getting up into the 80s for much of the interior. For Yukon, getting all the way up to 86 degrees. Up along the Arctic coastline, getting up into the mid 50s most locations. Some places closer to the water staying in the 40s. Then into the 50s to lower 60s for the west coast. Warmer as we get closer towards the Northern Sound area. Morning low temperatures dropping down into the 50s for the interior and into the mid to upper 30s along the Arctic coastline. Mid 40s for the Kotzebue Sound area and lower 50s for the Northern Sound. Then Monday afternoon highs getting up to around 80 degrees for much of the interior, getting up into the 40s for the Arctic coast, into the lower 50s for the Kotzebue Sound area and the 60s for the Northern Sound. Sunday morning lows for southwest Alaska dropping down into the 50s and then into the 40s for much of the Aleutian Islands. Sunday afternoon highs getting up into the 70s for interior locations of southwest Alaska and the 60s near to the Bering. For the Aleutian Islands, getting up into the 50s. And then Monday morning lows dropping down into the 50s throughout much of southwest Alaska and into the 40s for the Aleutians. Taking a quick look at our Monday afternoon temperatures, getting up to around 70 degrees at interior locations, and then closer to the mid 50s as we get by the Bering, and then right around 50 degrees for much of the Aleutian Islands.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Sunday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we have widespread IFR conditions, making it to the west coast of the state, but not really making it inland in southwest Alaska at this point. Up along the Arctic coastline, we will see some IFR conditions out over the water there as well. And then down in the Gulf of Alaska, we're going to see some MVFR conditions extending from Kodiak Island through Prince William Sound along the North Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle. As we move into Sunday afternoon, we're going to start to see some IFR conditions move into the Panhandle as well. However, along the North Gulf Coast and Prince William Sound, we're going to see some clearing of the MVFR conditions from the morning. Up along the Arctic coastline, some of the MVFR conditions are going to move into the North Slope. And then down the west coast, right along the water, we're still going to see IFR conditions. And those IFR conditions are going to extend out throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. On Monday morning, going to see a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions out over the Bering and Aleutians, and some of the MVFR conditions starting to make it a little bit more into southwest Alaska. Up along the Arctic coastline, going to see some MVFR and IFR conditions making it into the North Slope areas. And then down in the Gulf of Alaska, we're going to see MVFR conditions with intermittent IFR conditions along the North Gulf Coast, including Prince William Sound and down in much of the Panhandle. Monday afternoon, going to primarily be MVFR conditions in the Panhandle with IFR conditions along the North Gulf Coast from the Yakutat area through Prince William Sound. Up along the northern portions of the state, going to see MVFR and IFR conditions along the North Slope, and then MVFR conditions down the west coast of the state through southwest Alaska, primarily closest to the water. Then out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions is expected. For the passes, we are expecting to see VFR conditions for AKwx, however, the potential for afternoon thunderstorms is there. And Adigan is going to be the same, with VFR conditions expected, with the possibility of afternoon thunderstorms. Down in Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR conditions are expected. VFR conditions for rainy as well. Up by Windy, VFR conditions, but we are going to start to see some afternoon and evening thunderstorms. Isabel Pass is going to be similar with VFR conditions expected. However, there is the chance for those afternoon and evening thunderstorms. Mentasta, same way, VFR conditions throughout most of the day, with the potential for those afternoon and evening thunderstorms. Tanita should be VFR throughout the day on Sunday. Portage will start off in VFR, then improve to VFR in the afternoon. And Chilkoot and White should both be in VFR throughout the day Sunday. For freezing levels, we are going to see some surface freezing up along the Arctic coastline, but most of the state is going to be higher freezing levels, with some of the lowest actually being out over the Gulf of Alaska down to 6,000 feet, extending towards the Panhandle as well, but they're getting up to 8,000 feet as we get to the northern Panhandle and into south central Alaska, 10,000 feet through much of the southern portion of the state and along the west coast, and getting higher as we move out through the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands to the west. For our areas of icing, one primary area out over the Gulf of Alaska, extending out over the Panhandle above 6,000 feet for that area. For our jet stream, we are looking at winds surrounding our low out over the Bering Sea, coming in from the north, 80 to 85 knots, and then dropping down to 65, moving over the Aleutians. Strongest portion of the jet, however, is going to be out over the southern area of the Panhandle, 90 knots by the Panhandle, but getting up to as high as 125 knots just to the south out of a southwesterly direction. For 9,000 feet, we are going to see our strongest winds again on the south side of the eastern Gulf of Alaska low, and by the southern portions of the Panhandle, that could get up to as high as 55 knots, and then south of the area getting up to as high as 75 knots out of the west. Northern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, I'm going to see easterly flow 40 knots, and then northeasterly winds around 35 knots for the Bristol Bay area. Along much of the west coast, we're going to have stronger winds 35 to 40 knots coming out of a southwesterly direction. And then out over the southern and western portions of the Bering, we're going to see north to west winds 40 to 45 knots. Down to 3,000 feet, similar pattern to what we saw at 9,000 feet. With our low out over the Bering, we're going to see winds around that 35 to 40 knots. On the western side of the low, they're going to be out of the north. So you get by the central Aleutians out of a westerly direction around the 35 knots there. And then becoming more southwest as we get closer towards the Pribilof Islands and up by St. Lawrence Island around 40 knots. Just off the northwest coastline, we're going to see westerly winds around 35 knots. Some of our strongest winds are going to be down by the Panhandle with our eastern Gulf low, getting up to as high as 55 knots south of the area, and then into around 45 knots in the inside waters there. Taking a look at our turbulence, main area of turbulence with the stronger winds for the Panhandle area, especially in those inside waters and around some of the terrain there, we're expecting moderate turbulence below 6,000 feet.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse, we're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles in nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. Overall, we do expect the ice to move around with the local currents. The exception will be when we have strong southerly winds that will help push the ice farther to the north. Another area of note is that there are still some lingering flows in the Kotzebue Sound area. Taking a look now in southeast Alaska for Sunday, we are going to see southeast winds in the inside waters 20 to 25 knots until we get up by the Lynn Canal area where we'll see northwesterly winds around 10 knots. Out over the Gulf waters, seeing south to southeasterly winds 25 to 30 knots, becoming more easterly as we get into the northern portions of the Gulf 20 to 25 knots. Then on Monday in the inside waters, primarily southerly winds 10 to 15 knots, seasonally getting up to around 4 feet. Then in the Gulf waters, southerly winds becoming more easterly as we get farther to the north, around 25 knots. For south central Alaska, out in the Gulf waters, easterly winds 15 to 20 knots, becoming northwesterly by the Barren Islands, around 20 knots. Variable 10 in the Prince William Sound area, and then southerly winds 15 knots in Cook Inlet. For Monday, we are going to see continued easterly winds throughout much of the Gulf waters, 15 to 20 knots for the most part, a little bit stronger as we get farther to the east. In Prince William Sound, southeasterly winds 10 knots expected, and then southerly winds 15 to 20 knots for the Cook Inlet area. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, as we start out for the Alaska Peninsula area, westerly winds 15 knots, becoming more northerly 15 to 20 knots as we get closer towards Kodiak Island. Then on Monday, seeing westerly winds near Kodiak Island, 20 to 25 knots, becoming southerly as we get closer towards the Cold Bay area, around 15 to 20 knots there. For the Aleutian Islands on Sunday, southwesterly winds for most locations, 15 to 20 knots by the eastern Aleutians, up to 25 knots by the central Aleutians, and then 20 knots by the western Aleutians. For Monday, we're going to see primarily westerly winds for the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, 15 to 20 knots expected, and then more northerly winds by the western Aleutians, getting up to 15 knots. Along the west coast of the state, primarily southerly winds 15 to 25 knots, becoming westerly for Norton Sound area and dropping down to 10 knots, and then becoming northwesterly as we get south of Nunavik Island around 15 knots, and southwesterly winds 25 knots by the Pribilof Islands. On Monday, flow up north is going to shift and become more northeasterly, 10 knots in the Norton Sound area, and then 20 knots by St. Lawrence Island through St. Matthew Island area. As we get closer towards Nunavik Island and areas south, we're going to start to see southerly winds around our low pressure system, getting up to 15 knots. For Sunday along the Arctic coastline, out east, we're going to see easterly winds 10 knots, and then becoming south as we get to Utqiagvik and along the west coast, 15 knots up north, getting up to as high as 25 knots by the Bering Strait. Then on Monday, westerly winds along the Arctic coastline, around 15 knots, becoming northerly down the west coast, 15 to 20 knots expected. For a recap of our weather for tonight, we are expecting some of the afternoon and evening thunderstorms today in the interior to start to diminish as we move into the nighttime hours, but we will still see some lingering rain showers throughout some areas of the interior, down through the Alaska Range and through the Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see some fog develop underneath high pressure, and we will still see lingering areas of smoke through much of the mainland, with the highest concentrations out in the central interior, where we do have a dense smoke advisory out until midnight on Sunday night. Also of note, in the central and eastern interior, we do have red flag warnings out until midnight on Monday night due to the warm, dry, windy conditions, especially with the thunderstorms that we'll have in the afternoon and evening hours. Back to the tonight forecast, however, we have low pressure moving by the Gulf of Alaska that's bringing rain through the Kodiak Island area, along the North Gulf Coast, including Prince William Sound, and out through the Panhandle area, with that frontal system approaching southern portions of the Panhandle. Then out over the Bering Sea, we have a low moving into the northwestern portions of the area, bringing some rain closer towards the St. Lawrence Island area, extending down through St. Matthew Island as well. Some merging out ahead of this system is keeping fair weather for the Pribilof Islands, and then some lighter rain for the eastern Aleutians. As we look into Sunday, that low pressure is going to move closer towards St. Matthew Island, extending rain now through the Pribilof Islands and central Aleutians. Out over mainland Alaska, we will still see the potential for afternoon and evening thunderstorms for the areas of the Alaska Range up through the interior and into the Brooks Range, with areas of smoke through much of the interior and moving up into the North Slope area as well. Some lingering showers around south central Alaska are expected, and then some heavier rain as we get into the Panhandle. Finally, moving into Monday, continued rain for the Panhandle, extending now through the North Gulf Coast through much of south central Alaska, and still the potential for isolated thunderstorms in the afternoon and evening hours from the Alaska Range through the Brooks Range, and that does include the interior.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.